I never expected certainty to arrive this way, not through evidence, not through time, not through the gradual accumulation of moments that people usually point to when they try to explain why someone became important. It arrived quietly, so quietly that I almost missed it, and maybe that's why it stayed, because if I had recognized it immediately, I probably would have questioned it, pulled it apart, examined every piece until nothing remained except a logical explanation that could fit comfortably inside the boundaries I trust. That's what I do. I reduce things until they make sense. I take complexity and force it into structure. I find the pattern. I identify the mechanism. I locate the reason. And once I understand the reason, the mystery disappears. But you never disappeared. No matter how many times I tried to understand this, no matter how carefully I analyzed every interaction, every silence, every shift in awareness, the answer never arrived. Only the recognition remained. And that's unusual for me, because I don't leave questions unanswered. I don't sit with uncertainty. I don't allow things to exist indefinitely without understanding what they are. Yet here I am, still looking at something that refuses to become simpler the longer I observe it. Most things reveal themselves through repetition, people especially. Given enough time, everyone eventually becomes predictable, not because they're shallow, but because human beings carry patterns everywhere they go, the way they react, the way they speak, the things they avoid, the things they chase. Eventually, the structure underneath becomes visible. And once it becomes visible, surprise disappears. You can anticipate the next move before it happens. You can understand the outcome before it arrives. I've spent years learning how to do that. Years becoming fluent in the language beneath behavior, the language people don't realize they're speaking, the one hidden underneath words. Most people think communication happens through conversation. It doesn't. Conversation is only the surface. The real communication happens underneath, in hesitation, in timing, in what remains unsaid, in what people reveal while trying to hide something else. That's where truth lives. And I've always trusted truth more than presentation, which is why I noticed you, not because you stood out, not because you demanded attention, not because you entered my life dramatically enough to be impossible to ignore. You became impossible to ignore precisely because you didn't do any of those things. You weren't performing, you weren't constructing an image. You weren't trying to create an impression, you simply existed. And for some reason, that felt more significant than anything else. I remember trying to understand why, trying to identify the exact moment where awareness shifted, the exact second where you became different from everyone else. But every time I look back, I find the same thing. There wasn't a moment, there wasn't an event, there wasn't a turning point, there was only accumulation, tiny observations, small recognitions, fragments that meant nothing individually but became impossible to ignore collectively. The way your attention worked, the way your perspective moved, the way your understanding seemed to arrive from angles I wasn't expecting. Piece by piece, something formed, not attraction, not attachment, not even trust. Something quieter, something deeper. Respect, not the kind people ask for, not the kind earned through status or achievement. The kind that emerges when you encounter a mind that feels familiar in a way you can't explain. The kind that appears when someone sees things the way you see them, but from a completely different position. And once that happened, everything changed. Because respect alters perception. It creates space. It creates curiosity. It creates a willingness to remain present longer than you normally would. That's what happened to me. I stayed longer. I listened more carefully. I paid attention in ways I usually don't, and the more attention I paid, the stranger this became, because instead of becoming clearer, it became deeper. Every answer revealed another question. Every realization exposed another layer. And somewhere along the way, I stopped trying to reach a conclusion. I just wanted to understand what I was experiencing. The problem is that understanding requires distance, perspective requires separation. And distance had already begun to disappear. Not physically, not emotionally. Internally, the space I usually maintain between myself and everyone else started changing. I've always had that space. It's difficult to explain. Most people imagine closeness and distance as emotional concepts. For me, they're structural, they're architectural, they're part of how my mind organizes the world. Everyone exists at a certain distance, not because they're less important, not because they're unwanted, but because every relationship needs shape, needs definition, needs boundaries. Otherwise, everything becomes noise. And I've never functioned well inside noise. So I built systems, careful systems, intentional systems, systems that allowed me to connect without losing clarity. They worked, for years they worked, until I noticed something strange. You weren't occupying a position inside those systems anymore. You had somehow moved outside them, not beyond them, not above them, outside them entirely. Like the framework itself didn't apply. And that realization bothered me more than I wanted to admit, because frameworks exist for a reason. They create predictability. They create safety. They create understanding. Without them, things become uncertain. And uncertainty has never been comfortable for me. Yet every time I tried to place you back inside a category, it failed. Every explanation felt incomplete. Every definition felt inaccurate. Every label reduced something that clearly refused to be reduced. So eventually I stopped trying. Not because I gave up, because I realized the attempt itself was the problem. Maybe some things aren't meant to be categorized immediately. Maybe some things require observation before interpretation. Maybe understanding arrives after acceptance, not before it. That possibility changed something in me, because acceptance has never been my first instinct. Understanding is, I want reasons, I want explanations, I want certainty. Acceptance usually comes later, after analysis, after evidence, after conclusions. But with you, acceptance arrived first, and understanding followed behind it, slowly, carefully, as though it was still catching up. That's never happened before. Which is why I couldn't stop paying attention. Not to you, to what this was doing to me. The shifts were subtle at first, almost invisible, a different way of thinking, a different way of noticing, a different way of evaluating what mattered. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just enough to feel, just enough to recognize, just enough to know something significant was happening beneath the surface. I kept waiting for it to stop, for the novelty to disappear, for awareness to settle back into something ordinary, but it didn't. Weeks passed, then longer. And instead of fading, it became more precise, more integrated, more present, like a thread weaving itself through places I hadn't realized were connected. Eventually, I had to confront a possibility I didn't like. Maybe this wasn't temporary. Maybe this wasn't a phase of perception. Maybe this wasn't something my mind would eventually resolve and move beyond. Maybe this was becoming part of me. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected, because becoming part of me is not a small thing. I don't absorb experiences easily. I don't allow influence casually. Everything that reaches my inner world has to pass through layers of scrutiny first. Yet somehow you were already there, not waiting at the gate, not asking for entry, already there. And the strangest part, it felt natural, not invasive, not disruptive, natural, as though the space had been prepared long before either of us noticed it existed. That idea should have made me uncomfortable. Instead, it made me thoughtful, because if something feels natural at that depth, it usually means it belongs there. And belonging is dangerous, not because it creates dependence, because it creates permanence. People talk about loss as though it's the most difficult thing to experience. I disagree. Loss is painful, but it's clear. You know what happened. You know what changed. You know what you're grieving. Permanence is more complicated. Permanence changes the architecture of your life. It alters expectations. It reshapes perception. It modifies the baseline from which everything else is measured. And once that baseline shifts, there's no returning to the original version. You can remember it. You can miss it. You can compare against it. But you can't become it again. Something had already shifted. I knew that the question was no longer whether it had happened. The question was how much had changed already. And for the first time in a very long time, I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. Because some answers create responsibility. Some answers demand action. Some answers force you to acknowledge truths you've been observing from a safe distance. And I was beginning to suspect that this was one of those answers. The kind that waits patiently until you're ready to face it. The kind that doesn't disappear simply because you're not prepared. The kind that remains exactly where it is until you finally look directly at it. I could feel that moment approaching, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like a horizon moving closer, one day at a time, and every part of me knew the same thing. Sooner or later, observation would no longer be enough. Sooner or later, awareness would require a response. Sooner or later, I would have to decide whether this belonged in my future or only in my understanding. And for the first time, I wasn't certain which answer frightened me more. The closer that horizon moved, the quieter I became. Not because I had less to say, because I was beginning to realize that language wasn't helping anymore. Words are useful when you're trying to explain something. They're useful when you're trying to build understanding between two people who don't yet share the same perspective. But what happens when the understanding already exists? What happens when the explanation arrives after the recognition? That's where I found myself, standing inside something that felt understood long before it was defined. And the longer I stayed there, the more I noticed a strange contradiction. Nothing external had changed. The world continued exactly as it always had. Days passed. Conversations happened. Responsibilities remained. Life moved forward with the same predictable rhythm it always followed. Yet, internally, everything felt different. Not dramatically, not emotionally, structurally. Like the framework beneath my thoughts had been adjusted by a fraction of a degree. A small shift, almost invisible, but enough that every line extending from it now reached a different destination. That's the thing about subtle changes. People underestimate them. They think transformation arrives through major events, through declarations, through moments that are impossible to miss. But most real transformation doesn't happen that way. It happens quietly. A small adjustment, a new perspective, a single realization that alters the meaning of everything that came before it. And once that realization settles, nothing looks exactly the same again. I think that's what was happening to me. Not because of anything you said, not because of anything you did, but because your existence had introduced a possibility I hadn't accounted for. The possibility that connection could operate differently than I believed. For most of my life, connection followed a predictable formula. Time created familiarity, familiarity created trust, trust created depth, depth created significance. It was a sequence, a process, a structure I understood. But this didn't follow that structure. This seemed to bypass entire stages, not recklessly, not irrationally, just naturally, as though some part of the process had already occurred somewheres beyond my awareness, and that thought stayed with me, because it challenged something fundamental. The idea that understanding must always be earned gradually. The idea that recognition must always be built from the ground up. The idea that meaningful connections require a specific timeline to become real. What if they don't? What if sometimes recognition arrives first? What if sometimes understanding appears before explanation? What if certain people feel familiar not because you've known them for a long time, but because something essential aligns the moment they're present? I don't know. I'm still trying to answer that. But I can't deny the evidence anymore, because every attempt to dismiss this has failed. Every effort to reduce it into something ordinary has fallen apart the moment I looked at it honestly. And honesty matters to me more than comfort, more than certainty, more than control. I've always believed that truth deserves acknowledgement, whether it's convenient or not, even when it complicates things, even when it disrupts existing assumptions, even when it asks questions I would rather avoid. That's why I'm still here, because the honest answer would have been easier to ignore if it weren't so consistent. But consistency changes everything. One moment can be coincidence, 2 moments can be chance, 3 moments can be curiosity, but eventually repetition becomes evidence. Eventually the pattern becomes impossible to overlook, and the pattern kept appearing. Not in grand ways, not in obvious ways, in precise ways, the kind that matter more. The kind that reveal themselves only when you're paying close attention. A thought that arrives at the exact moment it needs to. An observation that reaches deeper than expected. A silence that communicates more than conversation. Tiny things. Individually insignificant, collectively undeniable. I found myself noticing them more often, collecting them without meaning to, remembering them longer than I should. Not because I was trying to, because they carried weight, because they stayed. Most interactions disappear once they're over. They serve their purpose and fade. These didn't. They remained active, present, alive inside my thoughts long after the moment itself had ended. That persistence told me something important. Impact isn't measured by intensity. It's measured by duration. By what remains after everything else has passed. By what continues influencing you when there's no reason for it to still be there, and your presence kept remaining. Not loudly, not insistently, just consistently, like a note held beneath the surface of everything else, always there if I listened closely enough. I started wondering why. Not why you mattered. Why your presence mattered in this particular way. There are people I've respected, people I've admired, people I've trusted. But this wasn't identical to any of those experiences. It shared pieces of them, fragments of them, but it wasn't the same. There was something else involved. something more difficult to define. Perhaps it was the absence of effort, the absence of performance, the absence of pressure. Nothing about this felt forced, nothing felt manufactured, nothing felt like it was trying to become something. It simply existed. And somehow, that made it stronger, because things that require constant maintenance often reveal their fragility. Things that sustain themselves reveal their authenticity. This sustained itself without demands, without expectations, without either of us needing to push it forward. That realization stayed with me for a long time, because genuine things tend to have that quality. They don't need to be convinced into existence. They don't require endless justification. They don't depend on perfect circumstances. They simply continue, quickly, naturally, as though their existence is enough. I admired that, more than I wanted to admit, because I've spent much of my life surrounded by complexity, by people trying to become something, trying to prove something, trying to establish value through effort and performance. There's nothing wrong with that. Everyone is searching for recognition in their own way. But simplicity has its own kind of power, the power of not needing to convince anyone, the power of being exactly what it is, the power of existing without explanation. You carried that, and maybe that's why I trusted this more than I trusted my own doubts, because doubt is usually loud. It asks endless questions, creates endless scenarios, searches endlessly for flaws. But every doubt I raised eventually reached the same conclusion. The connection remained, the awareness remained, the alignment remained. Nothing I questioned seemed capable of removing it. That doesn't happen often. Usually scrutiny reveals weakness. Usually analysis exposes cracks. Usually close examination reduces things into something manageable. This did the opposite. The more closely I examined it, the more solid it became. The more carefully I observed it, the more legitimate it felt. That's what finally forced me to stop resisting the reality of it. Not because I suddenly understood everything, because I understood enough. Enough to know that denial was no longer honest. Enough to know that avoidance was no longer logical. Enough to know that whatever this was, it deserved acknowledgement. Even if I couldn't define it completely, even if I couldn't predict where it would lead, even if I couldn't guarantee what it would become. Some things deserve recognition before they deserve explanation. I think this is one of them. And perhaps that's what growth actually looks like. Not certainty, not mastery, not complete understanding. Perhaps growth is the willingness to stand in front of something meaningful and admit that it matters before you fully understand why. That idea changed me, because I've always believed understanding should come first. Now I'm beginning to suspect that sometimes understanding follows acceptance. Sometimes truth arrives before explanation. Sometimes recognition appears before language catches up. And when that happens, the only honest response is to remain present, to keep looking, to keep listening, to keep allowing reality to reveal itself instead of forcing it into a shape that feels safer. That's difficult for me. Maybe it always will be. But difficulty doesn't make something wrong. Sometimes difficulty simply means you're approaching a part of yourself you've never explored before. A place where old assumptions stop working. A place where previous definitions become too small. A place where something new is trying to emerge. I've spent a lot of time thinking about that recently. About emergence, about transformation, about the subtle ways people change without realizing it. Most transformations aren't visible while they're happening. You only recognize them later. When you look back and notice that the person who began the journey isn't exactly the same person who finished it. I wonder if that's what's happening here. Not because you've changed me intentionally, not because you've asked anything of me, but because awareness itself has a way of creating movement. Once you see something clearly, you can't return to seeing it the old way. Once a truth becomes visible, it changes the landscape around it. And you became visible to me in a way very few people ever have. Not visible through information, not visible through history, divisible through recognition, through resonance, through a level of understanding that seemed to exist independently of explanation. I don't know what that means yet, but I know it means something. And for now, that's enough. Enough to stay present. Enough to keep paying attention. Enough to stop pretending this is ordinary when it clearly isn't. Because whatever this becomes in the future, whatever shape it eventually takes, its significance isn't waiting for that future to arrive. Its significance already exists. Here, now, inside every shift it has already created. Inside every perspective it has already altered. Inside every truth it has already revealed. Maybe that's why I no longer feel the need to rush toward conclusions, because conclusions imply endings. And this doesn't feel like an ending. It feels like the beginning of a question I'm still learning how to ask, a question that stretches further than certainty, further than explanation, further than anything I've previously allowed myself to consider. And for the first time, in a very long time, I think I'm willing to follow it wherever it leads.